Calgary is a very interesting place. I lived there for 10 years down in the southeast in a community called Mackenzie Town. Loved living in Calgary. And it is much more interesting and progressive than you might think. It is not the Texas of Canada. And sustainability and the environment and climate change, all of those are hotly debated topics in the capital of Canada's oil and gas industry. And I'm going to talk to Dr. Noel Keough about a book he's written called Sustainability Matters, which is all about Calgary. So welcome to the interview, Noel.
Nice to be here, Markham.
Look, why don't we start off with a summary of the book, please?
All right. So the book started off as the kernel of it was a series of articles that myself and co-author Jeff Gitter had been doing in the Fast Forward Weekly from a few years ago. And then it blossomed into something kind of a little bit bigger. So essentially, what we're trying to do with the book is to take this concept of sustainability, how we will live well into the future, and look at Calgary through that lens. So what we've tried to do is produce a book that starts kind of at the street level and local community level in Calgary and takes on everyday issues and using that sustainability lens to try to analyze and interpret them. But also what we hope it does is put Calgary forward as kind of an example of a typical medium-sized large city in North America, if not beyond in the world, looking at through the lens of sustainability. And even going beyond to kind of the global discussion about sustainability and critical issues that we hear of so much today, like climate change, like loss of biodiversity, that sort of thing.
So one issue I remember very clearly when I lived in Calgary was urban sprawl. Calgary has a very large footprint, there was always a complaint that the developers were in control of City Hall, and I know your book deals with that. What position did you take sort of in that debate?
I think in terms of sprawl, we really wanted to dig into the issue to try to understand the politics of it, how decisions are made, who are the power brokers in the city, to point out the problems with sprawl, to talk about the development of the Ring Road and how that enables more and more communities at the edge of the city. That because of the way the development industry has evolved over decades in Calgary, they do have a lot of political and economic clout in the city. And for that reason, we think a lot of good policies that have been put in place to try to control sprawl and to make our city more compact, more sustainable, less costly, haven't really come to fruition. I mean, we look at the last 20 to 30 years, and one of the analyses, I guess, is that Calgary has actually implemented a lot of really good forward-thinking policy, but it's in the implementation of that policy or marrying policy with budgets where we've fallen down, and to our estimation, still have a significant issue around sprawl and the expansion of our city.
Now, we just had an election, a civic election in Alberta, in Calgary as well. And Mayor Naheed Nenshi stepped down. We have a new mayor, Jody Gondek. But I remember in 2010, I interviewed Naheed many times during the election. And over the course of the years, he brought in some of that policy that you're talking about. And I think he had a fair amount of support on council. How is it then that if you have a forward-looking mayor, you have support within the council, how can they not overcome the bureaucratic inertia or opposition to those policies?
Yeah, I think in our take in the last 20 years, I would say that generally council has been kind of split down the middle. So my analysis would be that it has been actually very difficult to go beyond policy making and actually see the change happen, because we do have that kind of we have had that right-left split. I'm very hopeful after Monday that now we seem to have the balance of power in what we would call a progressive side of council. So I'm hopeful that we can actually get to that tipping point where some of those policies actually become reality. We'll see the proof in the pudding in one way in 3 or 4 weeks when the budget comes forward again, to see if we actually make some changes where budget dollars actually support the policy in place that can eventually actually see us turn the corner on things like sprawl, transportation spending. How many of us have to rely upon the automobile versus how many people are able to use transit, infrastructure for bicycling and walking in and around and through our neighborhoods and through our city, those kinds of things. So the rubber hits the road, if you will, in that spending, and then actually the effective implementation of the kinds of infrastructure projects that the policy is meant to support.
Well, when I lived in Calgary, I found it was a very car-oriented culture. I mean, everybody, wherever you wanted to go, you drove. And notwithstanding the fact that the C train was packed during the commuting hours, but the transit, it was difficult to design a transit system, I think, that would strike me as sustainable. The C train was 20 minutes away. Well, I could get downtown in 20 minutes. Why? And if I was in a hurry, then why would I take the C train? Those sorts of issues. Same with bike lanes. I mean, that was hugely controversial, 8, 9, 10 years ago. And I still see on social media, my Calgary friends complaining about not enough bike lanes and unsafe bike lanes, that sort of thing. How do you resolve that kind of tension? What does it take to make a more sustainable city, given Calgary's circumstances?
Well, I think you're right. I still teach and I talk with students, and they raise the same kind of issues. Well, that's great to think about transit and biking and walking, but our city is built for automobiles. And in fact, it has been built for automobiles. The age of the automobile, as we talk about, is, the 1950s, 1960s was the apex of that. And it was that period since the 50s, 60s through the 70s where most of Calgary was built. So as Councillor Giancarlo Carra is fond of saying, we've built an automobile habitat rather than human habitat. Now, what do you do about it? I mean, and again, the way that I put it forward is that, okay, we have an auto-centered city where it's very difficult to live without an automobile. Not impossible, but very difficult. And we also have climate change, which is probably the greatest existential threat to humanity that we have faced. So either you throw up your hands and say, we've got an automobile city, what can you do about it? Or you confront this existential crisis and you decide to put resources to do something about it. It's not going to change overnight. People are not going to be able to en masse give up their cars next week, but we have to start making those changes. One of the things we talk about, and I think the reality of what's happened in Calgary is we've kind of had a lost couple of decades in Calgary. As I say, we go back to things like Imagine Calgary in the early 2000s, the Planet process and long-term development plan. Those were good policies that were put in place, the cycling policy, the walking policy. We even turned our attention to things like the ecological footprint and how we consume energy far greater than most cities, that sort of thing. But we haven't taken those policies and put the budget dollars to making the changes. And that's where I think we have to go in order to solve the crisis that you're talking about. It isn't going to change unless we start putting money and resources to the changes that we know, that we've decided, we've identified in policy that we need to do. We need to put in the bike lanes. We need to boost transit, and we need to stop approving cities at the edge of the city and beyond the ring road where it will never be car oriented. Because if you look anytime you fly in or out of Calgary and you look out your window, all you see is isolated communities at the edge of the city surrounded by vast highways. That is never, or it will be very difficult to create human habitat out of that car habitat. But we can stop building those communities. We can put those resources to infilling the city, the existing part of the city, and begin to make it so that people actually can make the choice of not purchasing that very expensive automobile and move around and live in the city in a different way.
Now, one of the things I'm interested in, Jim, is the fact that I interview experts in a wide range of industries, transit and electric vehicles and so on. And it's pretty clear that there's some very significant technology changes coming that will have an impact on cities. And so let's talk about transit and transportation. We've got, there's already been an urban shuttle project, pilot project in Calgary, where autonomous electric shuttles, and we're probably 10 years away from autonomous electric vehicles like robo-taxis. I mean, many of these kinds of innovations could address the issues that you're talking about. Not all of them. I'm not saying they're a panacea, but I mean, if you want to cut down on GHG emissions, if you want to, maybe use the shuttles and the robotaxis as a solution to first mile, last mile problem for the C train, those kinds of things. And I wonder what you think of new electric-based technologies as finally an opportunity to address some of these really deep structural problems that Calgary has.
Yeah, okay. So the first thing I would say is we have a lot of that. The LRT is run on wind. It's run on electricity and clean wind electricity. So we have those technologies available. The second thing I would say is that in our estimation in the book, what we try to get across is we have to move beyond just thinking that it's a techno fix that we need here. I mean, that I think has been the dominant theme of what are we going to do about climate change and some of the issues we face. Oh, we'll just wait till technology comes along. And that, in a way, gives us license to do nothing till somebody invents a magic technology that solves all of our problems, and we don't have to change anything socially, anything culturally, anything politically. It's just all about the technology. So I think that's a fallacy and problematic to just have that wait and see attitude. In terms of the concrete things like electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, the jury is still out there in terms of whether that's going to make life better. I mean, it's one thing is reducing GHGs, which is important, but there's also issues of quality of life. And, the human consequences of the automobile. There are more people that are killed by the automobile on the planet than that rival the worst diseases that we have on the planet. There's the mortality and the morbidity associated with the automobile. Sitting in an automobile is one of the most unhealthy postures that humans can have, yet we spend so much time doing that, which the research demonstrates is bad for our health. It exacerbates cardiovascular disease, all kinds of things that allow us to not be active individuals and establishing a high quality of life in a city environment. You talk about even autonomous vehicles and electrical vehicles. If they're autonomous and electrical, there is nothing to say that there won't be just as many vehicles clogging our roads if they're autonomous electrical versus internal combustion engines. And in fact, you could make an argument that the situation would be even worse if you think of, for example, mom and dad and the two kids order up 4 autonomous vehicles in the morning to get to school and go to work. So there, the technological, I guess the bottom line for me is it would be a bad path to go down. And I think we're on the path and we need to adjust our future thinking to just rely upon technologies in whatever realm we're talking about to deal with climate change, to deal with biodiversity, to deal with issues of equity in our society. So that's part of the message of the book, is sustainability is much more than the technological fixes to get rid of carbon out of the atmosphere.
Well, let's talk about carbon, because the Calgary economy is, to a large extent, not a fair amount, powered by the hydrocarbon industry. It is the center of the Canadian industry. And what are your thoughts on that, and how did you deal with it in the book?
Well, I think, again, what we're trying to get across in the book, this idea of the lost decades, is that I knew when I was doing my master's work in renewable energy back in the late 1980s, and the world knew because of people like Hansen, who presented to Congress in the United States in 1988 about the climate change problem. We knew, and the evidence is more and more suggesting that the oil industry knew in the late 80s and early 1990s that this was a significant, difficult, critical problem, and yet they chose to ignore it, to obfuscate it, and to lie about it. So I guess the argument we make in the book now is we have lost the opportunity for a gradual transition because of this dithering. And now we're in a situation where we have to make a significant and very rapid transition in order to avoid the worst consequences that we see coming in terms of climate change. So in terms of the oil and gas industry, I think we have to move rapidly away from reliance on that industry. It's not just a matter of what Calgarians think or what Albertans think. We can't go against the tide of history on a global scale. And our resource is some of the most difficult and most expensive to get out of the ground and get to market. It will be the first to drop off the table as the world decides that it cannot burn any more hydrocarbons. So I think for all of those kinds of reasons, we cannot and should not rely on that industry, and we should rapidly, I'm talking, I would like to see a big change in the next 1 to 2 provincial regimes certainly I would like to say major change initiated in the 4 years of this current council. So I think we really, for our own good, as well as for the good of the planet, we have to get serious about making this rapid change that we ignored or avoided or turned a blind eye to for 35 years.
Great. Well, Noel, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks, Markham.